Hi, this is PULSAR 23, SOMA Labs 4-voice drum synth, and like their Lyra 8, what makes it special is its semi-modular design and welcoming approach towards feedback loops. You can use it like a traditional 4-part drum synth, but the whole point is rewiring it using the dozens of pins scattered throughout the surface, giving up control in exchange for unexpected timbres and rhythms. PULSAR 23 is not a regular instrument. In this video we'll take a look at what sets it apart from most drum machines for better and worse, take a listen to a few of its sounds, get to know it better by exploring a few patch ideas. Let's get started. Let's start with an overview of the point of a drum synth, or any synth, as opposed to sample-based drum machines or synth, is to design your own sounds. And PULSAR has 4 drum synths, each with their own independent sequencer called the looper here, because the sequencers are more like unquantized event loopers rather than grid-based sequencers. 2 of the synth engines are more tonal and can be tuned, and 2 are more atonal, with some spectral control, of course, and a bunch of other synthesis parameters, which we'll get to. Aside from control by the internal loopers and manual triggering, you can also trigger any one of the drum synths using the clock trigs or any other control voltage trigger, internal or external. And you can also play the bass synth using external MIDI, as well as trigger any one of the synths using external MIDI controls. You could sequence this with a drum machine, say like a Digitact. These triggers aren't velocity sensitive, but you do have 3 internal levels, either high, medium, or low. When you sequence these synths through MIDI or from your DAW, then they are velocity sensitive though. Aside from the 4 main synths, you've got 3 master effects: drive, delay, and reverb, and then a few utilities all around: an LFO, a SHAOS chaos generator, which we'll talk about, 2 pressure-sensitive contacts, 4 attenuators that you can control on the panel, a bunch of different utilities, a MIDI to CV converter, access to a few circuit bending components. From a connectivity perspective, you can connect PULSAR 23 to modular gear using these 8 jacks, which can serve as either inputs or outputs. You can send audio out the master output or any one of the 6 assignable 1/4-inch jacks in the back, and you assign audio to those outputs using these pins right here. Technically, you could also use the 1/4-inch jacks in the back and these pins to send and receive Eurorack or other modular control voltage or audio. Like I mentioned earlier, PULSAR can also be controlled by MIDI through the MIDI input in the back. You can use that to trigger any one of the 4 voices using MIDI notes or CCs, as well as assign MIDI CCs to the shape and warp parameters of the bass synth. You've got 4 additional assignable MIDI to CV pins on the left, and PULSAR 23 also supports clock sync over MIDI, as well as pitch bend and portamento. So pitch bend works as you'd expect. Portamento is a MIDI CC. So this is 0 portamento. I've assigned this knob to MIDI CC number 5, and as I increase the CC value it sends, you get more glide or portamento between the notes. The only way to control this parameter, by the way, is over MIDI. Now, the main stars of the connectivity show are obviously these pins sticking out from across the panel. You can connect them with your fingers if you want. So, for example, here we've got the clock outputs, and this is the mix audio input. So I could just touch this and get a click. Apparently, you can use cheese to connect these as well. More typically, you'll be using these alligator cables. So for example, if I wanted to connect this to the mix input, I'd just hook it up into here. If I wanted to use this to trigger the bass drum, I would hook it up into here. The nice thing about PULSAR 23 is that it's pretty safe to connect anything to anything. So as usual with semi-modular gear, audio and control voltage are one and the same, meaning that you can use audio as a modulator as audio or clock, Pins can be either inputs, outputs, or both. So for example, this pin is the clock input for the looper for the bass synth, and this pin is the audio output for the snare drum. However, this pin can be both an input and an output. So if I want to trigger the snare drum, I would send clock into here or trigger into here, and if I wanted to pick up the triggers coming in from the snare drum's looper, I would use this as an output to potentially trigger something else. One last thing you need to know about connectivity: PULSAR works in the 0 to 10 volt range and is unipolar. So the LFO, for example, goes from 0 to 10 volts as opposed to Eurorack, which typically goes from -5 volts to +5 volts. Anyway, it's typically bipolar. So some things will just work. For example, triggers work nicely, but if you've got an LFO going from negative to positive, you'd need to add 5 volts to it using a module like maths or disting. If you have a modulator that goes from 0 to 5 volts, if you wanted to go for the entire 0 to 10 volt range, you'd need to find a way to amplify it with a VCA, say, that could double its voltage. And then going back from pulsar to modular, you'd want to do the opposite, maybe attenuate it or use a module like maths to change the voltage range. So let's start by taking a look at the synth engines. First, the bottom portion is identical for all four. So you've got triggers on the bottom. You can either record taps into the trigger looper, we'll get to that later, have the looper play back when the switches are to the right, or just put them in the middle if you wanted to pause any one of the track loopers. All four synths have an attack, sustain, release envelope. So attack can be as slow as this, and then release. Doesn't get too long, but you have control over that. And they're ASR envelope, so as long as you hold the note, it'll play through. I already talked about the triggers. The envelope output sends the ASR envelope to any destination you like, which is useful as we will see later on. You've got volume control independently for each of the drum synths, and then an effects send that goes to the effects section. These four effects buttons go to an effects mix bus, which can go out to the delay or to the reverb, but not both. Both effects, though, still are active at the same time. So let's put a long delay and then go to the reverb. It's just that these knobs can be a send for only one at a time. You can create additional mix buses using the attenuators and then have both effects be active in parallel. And conveniently going up the panel, you've got these outputs. That's how you can create these mix buses or route each of the drums to one of the separate outputs, or use the outputs to create different feedback loops. And these feedback loops are, of course, what makes PULSAR interesting. So you can take audio coming out of the bass itself and say patch it to its tuning, or maybe take audio coming out of the delay and patch that to the tuning. I don't know what's going to happen now. Yeah, PULSAR is like a box of cross-modulated chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. Above the outputs are the external inputs and outputs. These can be used mainly to process other audio using the filters or drive control here. So you could patch anything to the external input here and apply drive to it, or use the low pass filter here, not just to process the bass synth audio, but everything else. So above this bottom section, which is identical, you've got this, which is unique to each synth. Like I mentioned earlier, you can tune the bass synth and then control its pitch envelope and drive. You've got the OMG and Where's the Fun inputs here, which are covered extensively in Vlad's videos, but let's just say that they can dramatically impact both the pitch envelope and the timbre, the overall timbre of the sound. Anyway, there's a 40-minute video about this and a 50-minute video about this, so I won't cover all the patches that are shown there, but let's just take a look at the bass synth. It has two main modes, either percussive mode or regular synth mode. In regular synth mode, it has let's just lower this, a shape control that goes from triangle to saw to square, and then a warp control that's like a wave folder, which is is always nice with reverb. But let's just listen to this. And then once you've added harmonics either with a saw or with the wave folder, then you can filter them, low pass filter with resonance. Really nice filter, I think. Nice and gritty. Doesn't quite self-oscillate, but does the job, especially if you add drive. So this alone, I think, is a very nice synth. Anyway, that's the bass synth in synth mode, but it also has a percussive mode where it changes completely. Now, all of these can be used for percussive sounds, but there's really no reason to limit yourself to that. Anyway, in this case, you can see that, yeah, it's certainly very different from what it was before. The shape knob adds noise to the sound, and depending on how you tune it up or down, it also changes pretty dramatically, whether without warp or with. So yeah, pretty wild synth as a synth, but also for percussive sounds. Gives, I think, a very wide range. Anywhere from synth to noise to metallic sounds. Let's move on and take a quick listen to the snare drum. This is obviously a snare synth, not a snare drum. It has a mix between simple noise and whatever spectral mangling the tune knob is up to. And it also lets you add a clap style dual attack stage, which can actually get pretty long. Now all this audio is processed by a bandpass filter with or without resonance. And this does either self-oscillate or pick up on the noise. So the snare drum can certainly be tuned quite nicely and be tonal, but you can't play it with volt per octave or MIDI control. I'll steal some thunder from the patch ideas section. You can use a Eurorack sequencer or any other kind of sequencer to take voltage and let's just translate it, say over here, and use that to play or sequence, say, the bass drum or the filter here or here. So let's, for example, take this and hook it up to the mod input of the bandpass filter. So I could sequence this step to this and then either, you know, play it through this or play it through this or sequence this. One thing I did notice though, when you touch one of these pads, these don't respond. I guess there's some electricity going over here that prevents that. But yeah, other than that, things work quite nicely with something like O-Control or any other Eurorack style touch or voltage sequencer. So that's the snare drum. Then there's the hi-hat, which has a high-pass filter with resonance. And the original sound is a metallic wave shaper again with warp. So this has a nice range anywhere from a metallic hi-hat or a metallic cymbal to just nice short noise bursts. So those are the 4 core synths. There are additional tone generators, which we'll get to later in the patch ideas section. Let's talk about sequencing this. The easiest but most limited way to sequence is by using the clock dividers. So I can tap into the 16th divisions here, hook that up to the trigger, maybe slow that down, then take another cable and say go from here to a kick. And if you wanted to go faster, we could go into here. And then obviously we can do without a snare. So let's maybe put that here and hook that into here. Now you'll notice that the snare is sustained, which isn't what we wanted to do. The clock triggers, other than the 16th note triggers, are all square waved clocks. So if you wanted to convert it to a trigger, luckily there's a utility on board for that. The impulse converter will convert it to a short trigger. Then we could connect that up to the snare and sculpt our own release for the snare. So that's how you can create a basic beat using the internal triggers and internal clock. And as you can see, things start to get pretty messy with wires pretty quickly. So that's one way of creating a beat. Let's clean this up. Another way is to use the trigger loopers. Each of the 4 synths has its own dedicated looper or trigger sequencer. While these are digital, meaning that they do have a certain finite resolution, for all practical purposes, they're a continuous unquantized loop with a certain quantization option. Their timing is synchronized by default to whatever the current clock choice is, whether it's internal, external clock, or MIDI clock. And they each time themselves to 128 clock clicks, whether it's the independent clock they receive through these inputs or a MIDI clock or the internal clock or external triggers. Now, since they're independent, if you want to make sure that they start and stop at the same time, you need to clock their restart using this patch. Now, when I make this patch, each loop will be 4 bars long. Let's make it a bit shorter for demo purposes. And you hit play by pressing bank and play, and then you can just start recording to any track you want. So I could say tap here. And did I start it? Okay, I've got this recorded here previously. I can hit delete and one cycle will erase that. Anyway, let's get going. So hit this, right? And we've got that. So that's a short loop, and then I could add whatever I want unquantized to this. So maybe I can override either triggers or sustained notes. Now notice, because the loop is short, I get this. I could make it twice as long like this. The first half is still there. The loop just gets twice as long because it's resetting less frequently. And now I can add to it. And that's how you record or sequence live into PULSAR 23. Now there's a quantize function. So let's say I felt that this was imperfect. If you hold all 3 buttons here, the sequence stops, and then I can choose to say quantize this track and then hit play again, which you do like this. And it attempts to align it to a grid that's aligned to 16th notes. So it's not a perfect quantization. Sometimes it works well, but often it doesn't give you the results you want. Maybe I'm using it wrong. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the clocks are synchronized by default, but it doesn't have to be that way. So I could say override the hi-hat clock by plugging it into the LFO and change its speed like this from very fast. Let's say we go to here. So the loopers are polyrhythmic if you clock them separately. A bit more about these loopers. PULSAR has got 4 banks of them. So if I hit play, which, like I said, you hold bank and hit play, and then choose a point in the loop to start, then this should happen if they're playing. Then you can move between banks by holding the bank button and pressing 1, 2, 3, or 4, one of these groups. So this is what I have in bank 2. I go back to bank 1. Stop if I want. And with the key combo, that through the miracle of editing I just looked up in the manual, you can copy the contents of one bank to the other. So if the loopers are in record mode and you hold bank and press, say, these 2, then I just copied the contents of this bank into this one. So, yeah, I didn't mean to add that, so let's delete that. Anyway, so this is bank 2, this is bank 1. I could say delete the hi-hats here because they're pretty annoying. Then go to bank 2 and get them back. So that's a nice performance function, but the shortcut is a little bit hard to remember. One last thing, when you record, let's go back to bank A and hit play. Play can start, by the way, anywhere you want within the loop. Let's just start here. Then you can record either full velocity triggers, let's erase that, medium velocity triggers, or low, or any combination thereof. Okay, so we talked about trigger sequencing, we talked about looper sequencing, let's talk about MIDI sequencing, which you can do either through a keyboard or through your DAW. PULSAR 23 has these conveniently placed learn buttons across the panel, so if I'm on MIDI channel 1 and I wanted to learn the bass synth to it, I'd just do it like that, then go to MIDI channel, say 3, and learn the kick to this key on channel 3, and then this to snare, and this to the hi-hat. You've got your basic drum machine, like I said, either sequenced through a keyboard or an external sequencer, and these are velocity sensitive. Then if I go back to the MIDI channel of my synth, I could MIDI learn my way into these two knobs just by holding this and turning a button, then holding this and turning a different button. Same goes for these four. These are MIDI learn buttons for MIDI CCs, and you can also use this for key tracking. Say if you want to modulate the filter while you're playing the bass synth up and down. And like I mentioned, you can also sync the clock to MIDI. It does take the loopers a bit to sort of get into it, about maybe a bar or two long until it catches up to MIDI clock, but you can sync to MIDI as well. Let's move on and talk about the effects. You've got a master drive with a mix control, which can get pretty aggressive. So you can even drive the drive further. This obviously increases level too. And then you've got a delay and reverb. Like I mentioned, you've got both of them active simultaneously, but the effects sends only go to one at a time based on the switch position here. So let's say that I've got it set to reverb and I want reverb on this, but I wanted a delay on the hi-hats. I would simply hook the output into the input of the delay, turn up delay, of course, then have delay here, and my reverb here without a delay. And if I wanted this as a variable send, I would hook it up through the attenuator and then send that back into the delay circuit. The effects have three modes. This impacts both of the effects. There's a single tap delay, obviously with time and feedback controls. This is an analog style delay, which is pretty nice. Anyway, that's mode 1, and in this case the reverb is a hall reverb. And the second mode is a double tap delay, again with variable time. And I think this is a similar hall on the reverb. And then in pitch mode, you get pitch shifting. Really nice. And the tune impacts this. Yeah, the effects here really shine. I'll take it. And this pitch shift mode also impacts the reverb. So it's either going down or up. And the pitch and the delay go in inverse directions. So in typical SOMA madness, you know, that alone is something that can be played with for a while. Okay, so those are the effects. Let's talk about SHAOS, which is the shift register chaos module. So this is a clocked semi-random sequencer that can generate random sequences that are either 16, 63, or 217 steps long. Internally, the sequences are either zeros or ones, so it generates a sort of random pulse or square wave. Let's connect this maybe to the filter of the bass synth. Now, the nice thing is that this generates a certain rhythm. So even though the initial sequence was generated randomly, if we like it, we can keep it, and if not, we can jumble it around by turning the switch either left or right, turning it back, and we get a different rhythm, and the other one is lost forever, unfortunately. So if we like this rhythm, we can keep it, and if not, we can jumble things around again. Listen again, jumble again, and so forth. Now, even though the sequence is a sequence of ones and zeros, you can bunch up either 2 of its digits in 2-bit mode or 3 of them in 3-bit mode, which gives you, instead of 0 or 1 or square wave, 4 or 8 levels or values or voltage levels that you can use to modulate any destination. So in 2-bit mode, you get a pattern that's 4 levels deep. And then in 3-bit mode, you get, let's maybe shift this around, 8 different levels. So 8 values, 4 values, and 2 values. Now, another way to mess up this pattern, other than borrowing from the 63-step or the 217-step pattern, is to use the sample and hold input. So let's just maybe clock this into here, into the sample and hold. Now, this works when it's in 16-step mode, and I hook up data into here. This is the ones or zeros that I feed into the sequence. And to hear this, I need to be hooked up either to the 3-bit or to the 1-bit outputs of the sample and hold portion of the SHAOS generator. And we won't hear it until we activate the clock. So that's the pattern, and I can mess around with it by, say, touching 10 volts or ground. So this gives you a certain degree, but not total control over what's going on. And hopefully we're on our way to a pleasing techno pattern as opposed to sending offensive Morse code to aliens. And of course, if you use the 3-bit output, you'll get 8 values. And you can change that around, obviously, as well. So you can keep auditioning patterns and hopefully something nice comes out, and use this to tune the filter or an oscillator or just to modulate anything. And that is the SHAOS generator, a semi-random step sequencer. That is a lot of fun, I think. If you're familiar with Turing machines, the concept is very similar. You just keep rolling the dice until you get something you like. Okay, let's talk about some patch ideas. The first patch idea is to use your hands as patch cables. We talked about this before, but just touching stuff intentionally or accidentally, like say the CV input here, I don't think it's meant to be touched, but it will change the timbre of your sound. For a more controlled experience, don't forget these pressure-sensitive touchpads, which you can hook up to, say, any one of the triggers. So even though these touch plates aren't velocity sensitive, these are, at least pressure sensitive. And I hate to reuse a joke, but if you want to hold a note, it'll cost you extra, but you can. Anyway, so that's FM, and by FM I mean flesh modulation. For a different source of FM, we shouldn't ignore the LFO over here, both as an oscillator and as a high-frequency modulator. So you could, in low speed, of course, use the LFO as a modulator, say, for pitch. So you could modulate the pitch, say, of the filter cutoffs and so on. In the case of the bass synth, the mod input doesn't impact pitch, but rather the phase of the sound, which is cool, but this goes well into audio rates. So yeah, if we just increase the mod depth and maybe go into much higher audio rates, set this to high. then you can get some really nice, aggressive FM sounds based on how you tune the two oscillators to each other, get nice metallic effects. Now that's nice, but let's take a listen to the LFO as an oscillator. I'll connect it to an attenuator so we can control it, and then feed that back into the main mix. So let's take a look and listen to the shapes here. There's a triangle in the middle, then it goes to sort of like a chopped off saw here. And a buzzier saw here. You can tune it here. And then you can also use the square wave output to go to anything from a thin pulse to square. And then at the right frequency, let's go in the middle here. You've got nice manual pulse width modulation if you want. Now, you've got a sync input to the LFO, which is something that you can use to restart it to fit a modulation to the tempo of whatever you have going on here. But at audio rates, why not use it as a hard sync effect? So this requires both a fast clock or other fast oscillator and a fast LFO, but really nice hard sync sound. So if you want to use this, you're going to modulate this for the hard sync sound and this to control pitch. A few more patch ideas. You've got a noise source in here, which you can hook up directly to the mix, obviously, or pass through a VCA, for example. So let's go through this one maybe. And then, yeah, it can get pretty tight here and noisy. Hook that up to the mix. Then use any one of these triggers to trigger it or to control the VCA. So, noise bursts, or use the envelope maybe. Okay, completely independent or alongside any of the sounds. Now this envelope can be used to modulate anything, right? So for example, the time of the delay. So this is with the modulation, this is without. And you could use an inverter to modulate in the opposite direction. Another quick patching tip, things can get pretty messy and crowded over here. So let's say that I was taking the 10 volt source and patching that to drone this. And I wanted to also, drone this as noise. So rather than going to the, let's take a shorter cable, to the 10 volt output again, I could just have this go lower and then go out here and patch this as an extension to the 10 volt output, let's say, into here. So now I've got two drones going. Anyway, just a nice way to extend patch connections. Another neat patch idea I wanted to show you. Let me just clear this up. We talked about triggering the different drum synths using the triggers, and that's fairly limiting. And I mentioned earlier the quantization here isn't that hot. What if we wanted different quantization for each of the drums? You can't do that. Currently, quantization only syncs up to this clock. However, we could use the clocks to trick the loops into running at different speeds and quantizing them differently that way. So if I got the 16 going into this and the 8, say, going into my snare, into the snare looper clock, and let's go to 4 to time the bass looper. Let's move these to record and get the loop going. Now I could clear them up here and finish a whole cycle. Hopefully, I need to set the clock pretty fast for this. So this will be our fastest loop. And it's still pretty slow for hi-hats. So what I could do is increase the speed even more beyond the internal clock by using the LFO to push the internal clock. So now I've got to tell the clock to stop listening to its internal heart and start listening to the LFO. Let's, push it up all the way as high as we can. Now, what I did find here is that there's a speed where this is just too fast. So we need to find that speed. And once you did, you can start recording, say, that, and then, it's too frequent for me, so I can take the snare loop and let's maybe make it even slower to the 2 clock divider. Well, now I hear you say, well, this doesn't sound too different from way back when you used the clock dividers to just trigger the drums. But there is a difference. The length of each drum loop is different. So in kind of like an Ableton Live style grid, you've got quantized clips of different lengths. And you can play unquantized patterns within those clips. So this is nice as long as you're okay with an even ratio between the different loops or the triggers. What if you wanted triplet triggers or triplet loop lengths? You can't do that internally here, but you can do that using an external clock like Pan's new workout. Here we've got clock going out from Keystep into PULSAR, then clock going from PULSAR through these adapters to Pam's workout, and then a regular clock going out to the kick and a triplets clock going out to the hi-hat. So I can get clock going in through here. If I hit play here, it'll take it a bit to get in sync. And then I've got triplets sent here through this clock, which in this case is a 3x multiple of the kick trigger. Now the reason I used MIDI to control my Eurorack clock is because now I've got the Keystep arpeggiator in sync with the Eurorack clock, which is driving PULSAR 23's clock. Okay, so let's talk about the pros and cons. On the cons side, not that this should be compared to other drum machines necessarily, but if we did, pretty much any other drum machine has more than 4 voices, so that's something you should be aware of, especially if you plan to use the bass synth as a playable synth, which is certainly tempting, which means you only have 3 drum voices. Another con, I think, is these alligator cables. There's no way around the fact that they're just not as fun or easy to use as Eurorack cables. Now, SOMA says that the reason they use these pins and these cables is to allow for many more contact points using a much smaller area and at a lower price. And indeed, PULSAR 23 isn't cheap as is, so it's great that it's not more expensive, but still, they are harder to connect and disconnect compared to regular Eurorack cables. That said, the pins and alligator cables do have an advantage. The first is flash modulation, like I mentioned before, for quick and interesting connections or timbre changes, and even accidental ones when you just lay your hand in the wrong place. And they do have the advantage of letting you stack more than 1 alligator clip at a time, maybe even 3 at a time, which means each contact point is really like a 3-way splitter or a 3-way mixer. Another thing you should be aware of, I mentioned this earlier, PULSAR 23 lives between 0 to 10 volts, so if you want to interface with Eurorack, you'll typically need to subtract voltages or increase voltages going in. It's not a must for triggers, but you do need to be aware of it in other circumstances. More on the cons side, I think the controls in this section are pretty confusing. Yeah, I know it now, but if I, say, leave PULSAR for a month and come back, will I remember the combinations for changing banks or for copying into a bank? Probably not. The quantization isn't really useful either, but I think that the clock timing trick that I showed you before is a really nice way to keep an unquantized flow, but still have some semblance of order in your patterns. Finally, for the cons, almost needless to say, but compared to other drum machines, there are no presets here, no undos, and no way to save loop patterns if you power down. Transitioning from the cons to the pros, I would have liked to see a MIDI through here, but aside from that, the connectivity is pretty darn great. The MIDI implementation itself is surprisingly broad, considering this is mostly an analog synth, and having separately assignable audio outputs is a must if you want to properly record and mix PULSAR 23. Try as you might to mix using the levels here, and there's a nice sidechain patch that I didn't show here but is in the manual. Your judgment might be impaired in the heat of an organismic jam, and separate outputs let you reconsider any decisions you made in real time when you thought that maxing out the drive was a good idea. Also, in a performance situation, you can use one of the outputs as a cue to work privately on your polyrhythmic masterpiece and then send it out to the main mix when it's ready. Something that few drum machines have. PULSAR 23 is very submix friendly. It would have been nice to use the loopers for automation, not just for triggers, though you can of course patch their triggers to anything you like and sort of work your way around the automation limitation by using long attack and release times. MIDI sync works well, but like I mentioned earlier, not on the first loop arounds or in the first few seconds. So if you're used to all your instruments singing together the minute you hit play on the master clock, you'll need to give PULSAR a loop or two to catch up. Beyond that, this is a drum synth and it excels at synthesizing drums and just being a synth overall. PULSAR isn't a drum synth trying to be an 808, 909, or 606. It has its own sound, and that's a good thing. I think it's for people who don't want the same old sounds, and if you're willing to explore, same goes for the rhythms. The nice thing about it is that it's capable of being unique while still being tethered to more traditional control or sounds if you like. Unlike Lyra 8 from SOMA Labs, which has no digital control, PULSAR 23 is fully capable of playing nice with others, whether it's your DAW or a hardware sequencer. You can trigger it using MIDI or your DAW, so if you want to use this as a companion module or tone generator that's still capable of all the craziness and cross mods that this does so well, that workflow is certainly there for you. So in that sense, it's much more beginner friendly, I think, than Lyra 8, but it also has plenty of SOMA grittiness, quirkiness, and polyrhythmic madness if you want it. So with MIDI along with the 8 Eurorack patch connectors means that PULSAR is very open to pairing and expansion if that's where you want to take it. So that's it for PULSAR 23. If you want plenty more ideas on how to patch and pair semi-modular synths along with every other idea mentioned in any of my videos over time, check out my ever-expanding book available to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. Hit like if this was useful. Don't forget to ring the subscription bell below if you want to make sure you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.